everyone. Welcome back to the American Experiment podcast. My name is Grace Keating. I'm here with Kathryn Hinderaker. And joining us this week is President of Center of the American Experiment, John Hinderaker. Thank you for joining us, John.
Always great to be with you, Grace.
Wow, this has been an insane week, both in Minnesota and at the national level.
I am in a great mood. I don't know about everyone else. It's like, honestly, I think it's negative 20 outside today, but I could not be happier. It's just clip after clip of great content from the inauguration, from Trump dancing on stages. How are you sad right now? You have to be happy.
How can you not be happy when the village people are performing?
It's so nice. Sometimes we get doomy and gloomy, I feel like, here, and it gets dark and cold in the winter, but there's only things to be happy about. So I'm feeling good. What was your favorite clip, Grace, from the inauguration?
Oh my gosh. I really loved Elon Musk's thumbs up moment to the camera I think it was when they were talking about going to Mars and putting the American flag there. And he just looks at the camera and he's like,
so good.
So funny. I also really have loved all of the photos of was it Jeff Bezos's wife who wore the insane blazer.
Yes.
I've been dying over those photos.
She wore lingerie to an
inauguration with a very low cut blazer over it, and that was it. If you haven't seen those photos, go look them up. It's pretty funny.
In general, the outfits, the attire, everything, it's so great. I love seeing women who aren't in pantsuits of various colors.
All of the Trump women were so beautifully dressed.
The high fashion, and every single look has been amazing. Usha also having beautiful Oscar de la Renta gowns. It's just so fun to look at and see these people who are, being totally feminine, but in places of power and beautiful. It's it's such a change, and I love it.
Yeah.
This is what happens when you put women in charge of the podcast. you get a fashion critique of the inauguration. I was trying to think of which of Trump's announced executive orders was my favorite moment. I hadn't thought to focus on the dresses.
But you got to look at the optics and how things have shifted to be so much just better and prettier and happier. And I don't know. I think one clip that maybe, I don't know if you guys have you seen Tucker Carlson walking down the street in D.C.?
No.
Okay, you got to go look this up. It's on X. He's walking down the street, and people were commenting on how it looks like out of a holiday movie. He's got no one around him. First of all, he's completely by himself, and someone's got him on a phone. And people are shouting out, Tucker, hey, Tucker, you're a hero. And he's just kind of waving, what's up, guys? What's up? He's skipping practically down the street. Tucker, can we get a picture? Absolutely, come on, walk with me, guys. It's the cutest thing ever.
Amazing.
People are happy again. It's just, and this is in D.C., not wherever he's from in Boca Grande or whatever. But anyway, I'm thrilled.
It's such an exciting time. You're right. We were talking about this morning. It really feels like history is being made before our eyes. And it's so rare that you can say that.
It is historic, Grace. I mean, for the last 4 years, and really going back before that, too, because the Trump administration, the first term, interrupted, 8 years of Barack Obama and then 4 years of Joe Biden or whoever has been in charge of the executive branch since 2021. The country was going off into the ditch. Mm-hmm. I mean, they were driving us into an untenable far left situation. And I was beginning to wonder whether our country was ever going to be able to recover from the damage that has been done to it, most recently by the Biden administration. But at the last moment, I think in the nick of time, normal people rose up. And we grabbed the wheel and got the car out of the ditch and back on the road. And I think what we were witnessing with Trump's second inauguration was a truly historic moment. I think this administration is going to be just vitally important to the future of our country.
That's so true. It really felt like we were headed down a very dark path there for a while. And no matter whatever angle you look at it from, energy, mining, public safety, the border, there were so many almost existential crises that if we had lost this election, I don't know, if we didn't have this huge mandate coming out of the people, I don't know what would have happened, honestly. It was scary for a little bit.
And it's reflected in how much Trump has done already with these executive orders. It's hard. I think we'll get into this maybe on future episodes too, what a lot of these mean. You were talking about how great the energy and mining executive order he signed is. We'll hear more about that probably in another episode. But so quickly, there were so many things he had to do immediately, declare a national crisis at our border, all kinds of things. that you could see, these things that are pent up that people needed and people wanted. He had tons to do on the first day, and it was great to see him do it.
Well, the app that they would give to illegal aliens, allowing them to cross the border and supposedly schedule a deportation hearing for which they will never appear, 10 or 15 years from now. That app was disabled at like 12:01, the moment after Trump was sworn in. So that's one place we're going to see important and immediate change.
Yeah. Well, let's turn our attention back to Minnesota because incredibly, there are some very dramatic and exciting things happening here too that have been, I think, fighting for attention.
This season of Real Legislators of the Minnesota House. Is that a good reality show title for it?
We'll work on it.
Okay.
Probably the biggest news story coming out of the last 7 days or so is, I think it was on Friday, the Minnesota Supreme Court ruled against Walz and saying, yes, it was illegal, him calling for a special election early on the vacant seat in 40B, which was not a vacant seat until Tuesday when the House convened and declared a vacancy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's exactly right. So, but we should always, when we talk about this, start with how did we get here? Let's just recap for listeners who might not have the full story in mind. So the DFL party controlled the Minnesota House of Representatives in the last session. But in November of 2024, the Republicans picked up, I think it was 3 seats, and it looked like there was going to be a 67 to 67 tie with 134 House districts in Minnesota. But then it very quickly developed that the Democrats' candidate in House District 40B cheated. Under Minnesota's Constitution, you have to be a resident of a district to run in that district, to represent that district. And in fact, you have to have been a resident of that district for 6 months prior to the election. Well, this guy barely went through the motions. He rented an apartment in the district, but he never turned on the electricity. And the evidence was overwhelming that he continued to live in his old house outside the district. So the Republican opponent filed an election contest, and that was tried before a judge. And the election contest was successful. And the judge actually issued an order barring this Democrat from seeking to take a seat in the Minnesota House of Representatives. So when the House convened on January 14th, the scheduled date for the opening of the legislative session, 67 Republicans were there and 0 Democrats. The 66 Democrats who were elected and had election certificates and could have appeared if they'd wanted to, all boycotted the legislative session. So everything that we're talking about is a spinoff from the fact that the Democrats cheated and got caught.
And well, in the Walz special election issue, it's good to remember too, came because the candidate who it was Curtis Johnson, right, who is not living in his district, he resigned from his seat, which he never held. You can't resign from a seat you're not holding. But Walz took that and said, "Oh, okay, so now there's a vacancy. I'm going to call a special election," which was, as the court agreed with, completely illegal. But Center of the American Experiment, I believe, is actually playing kind of an exciting role in that. Oh no, I'm thinking of a different case. But we can jump ahead to that.
Well,
maybe?
there are several cases. That's the caucus case. But let's stay with the special election, because this is, again, we have these ploys, these efforts to subvert our democracy and just refusals to follow the law at every level of the Democratic Party. Tim Walz, Steve Simon, the House members, even the Democratic Senate members are subverting our democracy. So what happened? So Tim Walz issued a writ directing that there be a special election coming right up in that House District 40B, because obviously the Democrats don't want to boycott the session any longer than they have to. They think they're going to win that special election, which, by the way, they act like it's their seat, like they own it.
So frustrating.
It's only a minor timing glitch.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. They got to have an election, right?
Yeah.
And so Walz prematurely issued the writ, and it was obviously illegal because there's a provision in Minnesota law that specifically applies to the situation where there is a vacancy as the result of a successful election contest. Okay, that is exactly what happened here, and there's a provision of Minnesota law that specifically covers that situation. But the problem is that section says that the governor can issue the writ 22 days after the session starts. Here, January 14, well, you issue the writ, you got to schedule a primary election, then you got to wait 2 weeks after that, you got to have a general election. And so the Democrats were obviously unhappy with that timetable, and that's why Walz tried to jump the gun. He got sued in the Minnesota Supreme Court. There's original jurisdiction there. And the Minnesota Supreme Court, in a unanimous per curiam opinion, held correctly that Walz's action was illegal, and they invalidated his writ for the special election. And it's really interesting, why did Tim Walz think he could get away with doing something so obviously illegal? There was never a serious question about it. Well, the answer is that we have 7 justices on the Minnesota Supreme Court, and every one of them is a Democrat. And I think the only explanation is that Tim Walz thought he could slide an illegal act past an all-Democrat Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court did the right thing, and they actually applied Minnesota law. So now the Democrats, there's another twist to this.
Yeah, I was
going to
say, I love there's more twists. John Phelan did a whole piece, if you want to read it, the catch-22 that's going on here. Because if you go to that law, it says the governor shall issue 22 days after the first day of the legislative session a writ calling for a special election unless the house in which the contest may be tried has passed a resolution which states that it will or will not review the court's determination of the contest. In that case, then the writ can be issued within 5 days of the passage of that resolution. The House did that. They passed that resolution on Monday. It has been 5 days. Why didn't Walz issue the writ then?
So that's exactly right. The Democrats could stop the bleeding on the timing of the special election, but they can only do that by accepting the House resolution, which the Republicans passed the first couple of days of the session, saying we are not going to contest this the court's determination, and of course not, because it was in their favor. And so that would give Walz the right to issue the writ within 5 days. But he doesn't want to do that, because to do it would be to acknowledge that the Minnesota House has been properly convened, is properly in session, and it has passed a proper resolution with 67 Republicans.
The situation is so funny.
And they are still maintaining that the House is not legally together.
Organized?
Right?
Yeah, properly organized.
And so Tim Walz has publicly said that it looks like that special election is not going to be held in 40B, and that representative will not be seated until around March 5th.
Just a ways off.
So apparently the House Democrats are going to continue their boycott for another month and a half.
Well, that's what Melissa Hortman has said. Yes, we will boycott until March. But what we want is so simple. We want to come back to work, is what she said on Almanac the other day. We want to come back to work, but the Republicans won't agree to our conditions. And their conditions are that they would allow they would allow the Republicans to have their speaker until that comes through, that special election happens. This is not what the law says is supposed to happen. So they want Republicans to agree to something that is not beneficial.
They don't have a right to it. Yeah.
No, they have no leg to stand on.
Well,
So
the
they have these
Republicans-
demands that they, for no reason, should the Republicans agree to, and they're not, thankfully.
Yeah.
No, the Republican leadership has been strong. So let's move on to that next issue that we've already started to touch on, and that is the issue of the quorum. So the Minnesota Constitution, in my opinion, is very clear on this. The Constitution says that a majority of each house constitutes a quorum to transact business. And then there's a separate section in Article 4 of the Minnesota Constitution that talks about what's required to pass a law. And that says no law shall be passed unless voted for by a majority of all the members elected to each house of the legislature. So that's the constitutional language. And so it doesn't say the number of a majority of the number of districts, or potential representatives. It's a majority of the actual members of the House. And the Section 22 on passing a law, in some sense, is even clearer. because it refers to a majority of all the members elected to each house. Well, currently there are 133 members of the Minnesota House of Representatives. There are 133 people who have been elected to the Minnesota House of Representatives, not 134, and a majority of 133 is 67.
Yeah.
So when the Republicans showed up to begin the legislative session on January 14, they had a quorum, and they also had enough people present to actually pass bills.
That's the big question right now, is whether they will start passing these bills. Because at first it was just, was this a lawful decision? Do they have the right to start running the House with 67 members present? And now it feels like the goalposts are kind of shifting a little bit. They're like, okay, it seems like this is flying, so should we start passing bills? And again, it's such an exciting time. We've never, ever seen this happen before in Minnesota politics.
And we'll have a recommendation, I think it is, from the court, right, on they're going to hear it on Thursday, and then pretty quickly they would release a recommendation, right, on whether or not it's a quorum.
Yeah. So a couple of cases have been brought in the Minnesota Supreme Court, again, original jurisdiction by the Democrats this time, suing the Republican leadership in the House, taking the position that there's not a quorum and they don't have a legitimately convened session, and trying to stop the proceedings in the House from going forward. We're actually playing a part in that case, as you started to mention a few minutes ago, Grace. We are an amicus. We have gotten the permission of the Supreme Court of Minnesota to participate in the case as an amicus, along with Take Charge and one or two other nonprofit organizations. We are being represented in that case by a powerhouse duo, Elon Werman, who is a professor at the University of Minnesota Law School, teaches constitutional law there, among other things, and James Dickey of the Upper Midwest Law Center have appeared on behalf of Center of the American Experiment as an amicus in that case. And what we do in our brief, and Elon and James wrote a terrific brief, which has been filed with the court, and they walk through the definition of a quorum in the Constitution, and they pull together all of the relevant authorities, including during Minnesota's Constitutional Convention. This point came up, and it was very, very clearly stated. I'll just quote one of the people taking part in our Constitutional Convention when they're debating this very provision in the Constitution. Mr. Morgan says, "I conceive that the word majority means a majority of the members sworn in. There can be no other meaning attached to it." Well, again, how many members have been sworn in? Well, as a matter of fact, only 67 members have been properly sworn in pursuant to Minnesota law. The Democrats haven't been. So you can make a very strong argument, which the Republicans have not yet sought to make, that a majority of the 67 are quorum, because the others have not been sworn in.
Mm-hmm.
They went through this fake swearing-in ceremony on a
In
Sunday
the dark
afternoon,
of night.
at the Minnesota Historical
There may have been
Society, supposedly sworn in by a retired Democratic Party judge. That was a farce with absolutely no legal significance. So another point that's made in our brief is that the United States Constitution has a quorum provision that's almost identical, almost word for word the same as Minnesota's, and certainly the same in substance. And it's very clearly interpreted under the United States Constitution that there are, 435, whatever that number is, members of the House of Representatives. And so for a quorum, if those seats are all filled, you need a majority of that number. But if there are seats that are not filled because of death or resignation or successful election contest or whatever it might be, then you need a majority of the number of seats that are actually filled. So again, that very strongly supports the Republicans' position in this case. And then the brief goes on and makes some other arguments about the structure of the Minnesota Constitution and how it talks about the houses and the members of the houses. And it makes the very fundamental point that a hypothetical future member of the House, that is, the person who someday is going to be elected in 40B, that hypothetical future member of the House is not a member, not an elected member
Right.
for purposes of a quorum or for purposes of determining the majority that's required to pass legislation.
Now, can you quickly explain for our listeners what an amicus brief is, what that means? I've always heard that it means, friend of the court. It's information provided by a third party in a case. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Amicus, I think, is Latin for friend, and it's a longstanding tradition in American courts that parties who have got some kind of an interest in the case, for whatever reason. Now, the interest is not a financial interest. I mean, the interest can be rather tenuous, right? So, for example, the interest of Center of the American Experiment that's recited in the application to submit the amicus brief is that we frequently testify and help to draft legislation in Minnesota's legislature. And so our work would be frustrated if a minority, like the Democratic minority in the House of Representatives, were able to bring legislative proceedings to a halt. Mm-hmm. So the court has granted us permission to appear as an amicus and to file a brief as an amicus, setting forth our view of the legal issue in question. When you're an amicus, you don't get to argue. You file a brief, but the arguments will be done by the actual lawyers for the actual parties to the case.
Sure. Any final thoughts on this, or should we move on to the Senate, where other crazy things are happening?
No, I think my final thought is just that, I mean, the Democrats, they complain and complain and complain about the Republicans, but we have to go back to how we started the show, which is that they are in this position because they cheated and they got caught. Perjured himself, and now they want no consequences. There are consequences for actions. Time and time again, Democrats want no consequences. When you read the law, it's straightforward. There will be consequences, and frankly, it's not even that big of a consequence. So they need to accept it at some point.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my parting comment, Grace, would be that the law here is very clear. This is not a hard case. This is not a hard decision to make. I think it's just crystal clear under Minnesota's Constitution that there is a quorum in the House. It's not only a quorum, but the 67 Republicans absolutely can pass bills and send them out of the Senate. So I think if the Minnesota Supreme Court does the right thing, as they did in the first case on the special election writ, we're going to see the Democrats frustrated.
Sure. Moving over to the Senate, if you guys will recall, last year Senator Nicole Mitchell was caught burglarizing her mother-in-law's?
Yeah,
stepmother?
Stepmother.
Oh, yeah, stepmother.
She was caught, and I believe, the trial has now been delayed.
Yeah, it was supposed to be January 28th. It's been delayed, at her request.
Until July at the earliest?
Yeah.
Because, we're in session right now, which is hilarious because I think it was the Senate Ethics Committee refused to take any action against her last year because they were in session and the courts hadn't done anything.
We'll leave the matter to the courts, and now the courts are like, let's throw it back to the Senate. Like, well, we'll just wait on this one.
Just kick the can down a little bit farther.
This keeps getting delayed.
And this is vital because the Democrats hold a 34-33 edge in the Senate. So if they lose the burglar, then it's tied. They can't pass anything. Yeah. And of course, this is so comical. Last year, after she got caught crawling out of her stepmother's basement window in her cat burglar costume, having stolen her stepmother's laptop and some other things, the Republicans said, the Democrats said, innocent until proven guilty. They took a vote on whether she would be permitted to vote for the remainder of the session. And she cast the deciding 34th vote in favor of herself being able to vote.
It's so gross. Have some integrity. You know what I mean?
They have none. And so she voted and participated through the rest of the session. As soon as last year's session was over, the chairman of the DFL party and all these leaders of the DFL party came out and said, she's got to resign.
Yeah.
She's got to resign. But she didn't resign.
Good timing.
She didn't resign. She's hanging on to her seat. Well, here we are at this year's session now beginning, and so the calls for her to resign have stopped, and she's going to be in there casting the deciding vote time after time.
Yeah.
So we've covered Democrats that have cheated, lied, robbed their family members, broken into houses. What's next? on this season
don't wanna know.
of our to be determined on the name, but our reality show going on in Minnesota. We'll see.
Oh, it's also worth pointing out that the Senate, think we were talking about this before the show started, that they're stalled right now. They're not able to pass anything. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, they are able to. They're choosing not to.
Right.
The Democratic 34-33 majority in the Senate is going along with this charade, this pretense that the House isn't really in session. Now, the House is in session. They're over there. They're having committee hearings. In fact, our people are testifying at committee hearings that they're holding. And pretty soon, I think they're going to start passing some bills. But the Senate Democrats are going along with this pretense that the House is not properly convened, not properly in session. And so they're not doing anything. And as I understand it, the logic here is that if they pass a bill, part of that built-in process is to send the bill to the House. That's part of what they're voting to do, is to send the bill to the House. And as I understand it, they're taking the position that, well, there isn't any House. And since there isn't any House to send the bill to, we won't pass any bills.
Right.
So here we are. We got a huge budget deficit looming. This is a budget year of the biennium, where the key thing that the legislature has to do is pass a budget for the next 2 years. And Democrats are refusing to show up, refusing to participate, refusing to legislate. It is a spectacle the likes of which we have never seen.
That's a great segue, too, because I do want to briefly touch on Walz's budget proposal, which just came out. And I think we'll get into this more in depth in the coming weeks. We might bring on some special guests to talk about the budget and the intricacies of it. But I did want to point out one of the things he's graciously offering is to lower the state's sales tax rate for the first time ever. And how much were we going to save on that sales tax? Was it
7.5 cents on $100?
Yeah,
right?
7 cents for every $100 you
cents for every
spend.
$100.
Thank you so much, Walz.
Yeah.
It's really nice of you.
And not only that, he's lowering it, but he's adding the tax to services, which were not previously taxed. So he's expanding everything that's going to get taxed, but lowering it by a teeny tiny amount.
So we can still say it's a cut. You know, everyone, thank you, please.
Although, reading what Bill Glenn wrote about this, he called it dead on arrival. There's no way this happens. Lisa Damuth has said there will not be, tax increases like are clearly in here. So I don't know.
Which is great.
Do you know? Does this mean anything? Why does Walz even propose a budget when everyone's like, nah, we're not going to do that?
I think it's statutory. In other words, the governor, I think, has to propose a budget. And there are certain deadlines, I believe, in law. There's a process. The Revenue Department will have forecasts and so forth. And so there's a timetable, there's a process, and it's certainly proper for Walz to propose a budget. Now, the content of the budget is something else, and that's something I'm sure you guys will be talking about in future podcasts.
Any final thoughts on the craziness of the last 7 days?
Not really. I mean, I think the one thing we can take away, I do have one closing thought, which is that you look at everything that's happened with the Minnesota Republicans being able to really hold firm, hold the line. They have not backed down at all. And this is almost a change we have seen, I think a lot of Minnesotans will feel, since in the past where our Republicans were more likely to compromise or bend the knee, maybe you would say. And I think that that's in large part because of the systems that all the conservatives in Minnesota have built. Places like American Experiment growing a lot, Upper Midwest Law Center, Take Charge, all of these great organizations that we've mentioned now have a support system in place to be able to bring these issues to the court. Really,
and to the public.
And to the public, so that people know this is going on. So it's given these Republicans the strength to be able to stand up to what the Democrats are doing, which is, again, cheating, lying, stealing, etc.
My parting comment, Grace, would be that there's such an obvious contrast between the dysfunction that we are seeing here in Minnesota and the inspiring progress, the hopeful change that we're seeing in Washington, D.C. It makes what's happening here in Minnesota seem all the sadder by comparison.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in this week. Stay tuned. This Thursday, we are dropping a special episode. Our resident public safety expert, David Zimmer, is going to be sitting down with Hennepin County Sheriff Witt. You don't want to miss that, so stay tuned for that.
Yeah, and also, before you go, make sure to leave us a comment. We want to hear from you guys. Let us know if you were a Republican in the House right now and the world is your oyster. What bill are you introducing? They released like their top 10, I think I've seen, and I don't know if they've done any more, but What would you do? Let us know in the comments. You can do like YouTube or Spotify has comments too. We'll read some of them on next week's episode.
Thank you guys again. Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, and we will see you next week.